Good afternoon, Cameron University. This week in SGA, senators and representatives voted on a piece of legislation concerning visitation policies in the Shepler dorms. A new president, vice president, and treasurer were elected to office. All this and more coming up on this final episode of This Week in SGA. New executive officers were announced immediately after the voting booths closed several weeks ago. Cody Gardner will serve as president, Chad Hagermann as vice president, and Taylor Brunwald as treasurer. CUSGA reporter Mitch Watson sat down with Cody Gardner to discuss her plans for the upcoming year.
As former president of SGA Daniel Brown slammed his gavel one last time, Cody Gardner stepped up to fulfill her elected position as the new president of SGA. For This Week in Student Government, this is Mitch Watson reporting. This month, students at Cameron University voted to decide the new executive office members for next year's Student Government Association. Taylor Brunwald has been chosen to serve as treasurer, Chad Hagermann for vice president, and Cody Gardner as president. This week, the elected officers took their positions. Gardner led the association as they discussed Vice President Chad Hagermann's legislation concerning extending dorm visitation hours for the third week running. Now that Gardner has won the position of president, she has begun planning for next year's association.
Our major plans are to, well, we have a lot. There has already been legislation brought to me by Holly Neville, but we have some issues with some international things. Some of the international students have brought me some things, and littler clubs have come up to me with something, and so I want them to feel that they have as big as a voice as PAC or student housing and even SGA, even if they are smaller.
After the meeting was adjourned, members proceeded to a party where they celebrated the end of the 2009 to 2010 SGA term, and there was much rejoicing. For This Week in Student Government, I'm Mitch Watson.
This week in SGA, senators and representatives voted against legislation to expand the visitation policy in the Shepler dorms to 24 hours. Today we have newly elected Vice President Chad Hagermann with us to talk about the legislation and why it is important. So thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's get a little background on the legislation. What did it call for?
What it called for is 24-hour visitation policy in both the Shepler dorms, girls and boys. And there are a lot of amendments on the floor, changing a couple things. First off, we asked that there be another desk put in on the north side of Shepler. We asked that it was only a trial period for 1 year. We asked that roommates be paired up if they wanted the policy and did not want the policy.
Okay, now why did you decide to write this piece of legislation?
I had some students come up to me and talk about how the policy was a little unfair. When we had the ice storm, I had a student talk to me about how one of her friends had to drive all the way back to Elgin the night of the ice storm because she wasn't allowed to stay here at Cameron.
So why do you think the legislation did not pass?
I think a lot of people saw some problems with security and some other issues that had came up. They didn't feel like the roommates were represented well, some other things like that.
So this legislation, correct me if I'm wrong, was modeled off of legislation that's been presented before. How is it the same? How is it different?
In the sense that it was it obviously called for 24-hour legislation, which has been presented in the past. Ideas like creating multiple floors instead of just one floor. Other legislation has called for just one floor. Some legislation has called for a separation of classifications, whereas upperclassmen would have visitation and others wouldn't. And this just really is the most open piece of legislation. It calls for everybody to have 24-hour visitation policy unless they don't want it, and every floor to have it.
Okay. How did senators and representatives react to the bill? Like, what were some of the questions they asked, concerns maybe?
A lot of concerns were how we look compared to other colleges with visitation policy. Across the board, Cameron does have a very lax visitation policy for their dorms, concerning that we let freshmen have open visitation on the weekends, but yet other universities like OU do not. Their upperclassmen, though, have 24-hour visitation policies.
Okay. I understand you did some research on the legislation. Talk a little bit about that. What kind of things did you have to look into?
I created a survey and I handed that over to Casey Case, the housing director, for him to submit. What happened is the RAs were given it, and they passed it out to all Shepler residents, and they were asked to turn it into the box at the Shepler desk. And those questions were just, have you ever not checked in a guest because of the 24-hour visitation policy? Would you utilize a policy? Would you be more likely to check in a guest if you had this policy? And would you like a 24-hour visitation policy? And the results were overwhelming that most students wanted a 24-hour visitation policy. 59% of the people polled said that they had not checked in guests because of the current policy, and 90% of the people polled said that they would check in guests if we had a 24-hour visitation policy. One of the only problems is that I only had 39 people polled out of the roughly 250 people who live in Sheplers. Now, we had a lot of questions on the floor of why we only had 39 people turn in their surveys. My feeling is that I feel like Cameron University students, especially some of those who live on campus, feel like their voice isn't heard, and I really want to change that.
Okay, so I understand you're most likely going to bring this legislation up next year again. So how are you going to get the word out to the students that, hey, if you want to change, let me help you do it? Or how are you going to convince more students to participate in the kind of survey?
Well, we got the voice out a little bit, but I want students to be more involved outside of Student Government Association. With my new office, I plan on raising up the public relations and maybe getting more students involved with our legislation and having their voice be heard. More so, some of the opponents of the bill have come up and talked to me and said that this is a great idea and they'd like to help me rewrite it next year so that we might be able to get it passed.
Okay. What kind of things do you think that you'll have to rewrite into? What kind of things do you think it will take to make the administration say, okay, let's try a 24-hour policy?
More restrictions in the piece of legislation, maybe not so much a free legislation to let, or free policy letting all students have 24-hour visitation policy, maybe letting some of the upperclassmen have it or limiting it to one floor. Another thing is security. We've talked about putting in glass doors on the landings of where the elevators are on each floor so that you have to have a key card to get off for security reasons. Also, we had an issue with the bathroom situation and how we didn't want opposite sex using the bathrooms of the dormitories. Ideas have been brought up to maybe making one bathroom of the two on each floors being a co-ed bathroom.
Okay. Well, I wish you the best of luck on rewriting the legislation and presenting it next year. And I have to say congratulations on being elected to Vice President. That must be exciting, right?
Very much so.
So what kind of plans do you have for next year?
Like I said, I want to boost the public relations. I want students to realize that Student Government Association is their voice. We've had a lot of people come up and talk to us about how they didn't feel like their voice was heard this year in some of the pieces of legislation that's passed. And we want to make sure that they hear about the pieces of legislation that are coming up and they get to hear their voice and they're represented.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming on the show today. You've been a very pleasant guest to have all year long, and I know you're going to do a great job next year in SGA.
Thank you, Amanda.
That's all the time we have left for today. Thank you for watching Season 3 of This Week in SGA. Be sure to check out more CUTV shows on Aggie Central by going to aggiecentral.com. The shows are posted in the top right corner of the home page. For everyone here at CUTV and for This Week in SGA, I'm Amanda Finch.